Alrighty, Bio30S, welcome back. We are back in the main room here for carbohydrates. This is going to be a quicker one because there's not as much content to cover. So let's jump into carbs or carbohydrates. The carbohydrates, these are typically going to be the sugars that we're interested in, whatever form those sugars are going to be. And we're going to see that there are multiple different ways that we can see that. It comes from a French word. Basically, it just means that it's a hydrate of carbon, if I'm not mistaken. And plants are going to produce these through photosynthesis. So they're taking the energy from the sun and they're converting them into some sort of energy. In this case, it's going to be a sugar that we should be able to consume. This is going to be the primary source of energy for most living things. So if you generate ATP in any format, or if you are undergoing cellular respiration, this is going to be the energy source for the respiration. So us in our mitochondria, so we're going to take those sugars to make ATP. All these compounds are going to be composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, hence carbohydrate. And then they have this general formula. It's going to be CH2N O, and then you can put an N on the outside of that. What that really means, a little bit of math. The N is representing some number. So let's say, for example, N is equal to 5. That means that you have C5H10 because you had the 2N for the H. And you have 5 oxygens at the end of that as well. So you're multiplying that 5 in. That tells you that you have a 5 carbon membered sugar. You have 10 hydrogens and 5 oxygens attached to it. That's maybe beyond the the scope of the class because that's getting into chemistry a bit, but that is the general idea of what a sugar is going to be. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can classify them, depending on how many subunits you're going to have for the sugar. So if it's just one single structure, we call that a monosaccharide. Mono for the word one, and saccharide for sugar. So a monosaccharide for 1 unit. If you have two, we call it an oligosaccharide. I prefer to call those disaccharides. Mono and di are a bit easier to understand. So di for 2 sugar units that are combined together in some way. And if you have three or more, we call those polysaccharide. Poly meaning that there are many sugars in this large sugar, so many units in the sugar, I should say. You might have heard of poly from like polygon, for instance. Poly means multiple sides to a shape. In this case, polysaccharide is multiple units to a sugar. So let's take a look at what those might actually look like. Starting with the monosaccharides, these are going to be your simplest of the sugars that you've got. And they are very simple molecules or single molecules. So they're very easy, usually for us to work with. But as we mentioned before in previous classes, it depends on what direction the molecules are facing. It might exist in a slightly different way. So all of our carbs that we have are going to be made up of monosaccharides. So if you have a disaccharide, it's just you're combining two monos together. If you have a poly, you're having three or more of these monos that you're combining together. So these are going to be the basic unit of everything that we've got. The sugar that we're typically used to is glucose. This is what's typically made by photosynthesis. You can also find fructose, which is made by various other fruits. Slightly sweeter sugar. You can detect it as a sugar, but it might not have the same effect as glucose might. And then you can get also a galactose, which is very similar to a glucose. A couple of images of what that looks like down at the bottom right. We've got a structure for glucose. As you can see, we've got a 6-membered ring. 5 of those C's are on the outside of the ring. One of them is going to be an O. And then one of those C's, the last one, comes up at the very top. So this is a six carbon. Your N is going to be 6. A 6 carbon sugar, and that is glucose. Fructose, slightly different. This is now a 5-membered ring, so it's quite similar, but it's only 5 members. So it's almost identical, but the structural shape is slightly different. It still does have 6 carbons in it, except one of those carbons is pointed upwards, just like it was in glucose. That other carbon is now pointed downwards. It's no longer a part of the ring itself, so it's a 5-membered ring. And then lastly, we've got beta D galactose. Galactose is quite similar to glucose. If you look at the structure on the left and the structure on the right, they actually look quite identical to each other. But the one major exception is, hey, take a look at these alcohol groups. These ones on galactose are pointed upwards, and on glucose, they're pointed downwards. Okay, so we mentioned this before. I think the visual helps a little bit that you can have the same molecules, the same elements that make up the molecules, but depending on the direction that they face, and that's the beauty of organic chemistry, depending on the direction that they face, they're going to behave differently. Disaccharides are going to be two units together. If you want to see the cartoon, it's there as well. So disaccharides are going to be two of these sugar units working together. So we're going to combine those two sugar units into one. So we call them double sugar molecules or two sugar molecules. In this case, you're taking a monosaccharide and another monosaccharide, and you're combining them together. So you take those two monosaccharides, you put them together, and now you have that disaccharide molecule. Sucrose, which you see as table sugar, so the sugar that you know you're putting in your pancakes or you're making icing for cakes with. It's usually sucrose. This is when you take a glucose molecule and you combine that with a fructose. So that is going to be your two monosaccharides combined together to give you a disaccharide. So glucose plus fructose gives you sucrose. Another example is maltose. If you take glucose and glucose, you take two glucose molecules and you combine them together, you get what's called maltose. And an interesting one is lactose. Lactose is the sugar in milk. This is where you take glucose and galactose. And it has a very interesting way of bonding where they're bonded by this oxygen. One of them is bonded from the upper side, one of them is bonded from the lower side. And it's kind of a strange way of this, like of the molecules binding together. Because of this, you need a very specialized enzyme to break the sugar down, and our bodies stop producing this at a point. This is why people can get lactose intolerant, is because they don't have the enzyme in their body to break down this sugar. So when you get lactose-free milk, you might notice that it tastes a little bit sweeter because what they've done is they've added the enzyme to the milk, and the enzyme is breaking that lactose into glucose and galactose. You're tasting the glucose because of the enzyme. Another option you have if you're lactose intolerant is you can take those enzyme pills that give you lactase, which is the enzyme for lactose. So if you have that enzyme inside of your digestive system, when you drink regular milk, your body is able to break down the lactose because you've put the enzyme into your body. These disaccharides are formed by a reaction called dehydration synthesis. So dehydration synthesis, I'll show you what that's all about here. Let me just move my camera over for a second. So dehydration synthesis, that's when you're putting two things together, but you're dehydrating the molecules that you're putting together. In this sense, if you're dehydrating, you're taking water out. So if you're dehydrated, you're lacking water. In this case, we're taking water out. Most of the things in our body are going to be formed by dehydration synthesis. You can also call it a condensation reaction if you wanted to, because you're condensing that water out. If you take a look at an example here of two sugars that we're combining, at the very ends of the sugar, you notice that there are alcohol groups. There's one on the bottom here, and there's one on the bottom here. They're outlined in those red squares. Well, an alcohol is an OH, and if you have two OHs, you have water. You have H2O and an extra oxygen. And that's actually what happens is the reaction itself, that oxygen is what's going to bind the two sugars together, and what's left over is an H2O, and that actually leaches out of the system. So now you have dehydration, the water comes out. And in this case, you have synthesized a new sugar by removing that water molecule. So that's how we can make the sugars. That's how a lot of organisms make these sugars or store these sugars. Um, when we break them down in our body, we undergo something called hydrolysis, which is the opposite. So that water that you're drinking that's getting into your body, well, now we can use that water, throw it back into a sugar, and break them off into monosaccharides, which our body can actually do something with. Glucose, in particular, for energy source. Things like lactose are going to be useful for storage in other parts of our body. And that's where polysaccharides come into play. Polysaccharides are very long sugar polymers. It depends on which way you link them up together because sometimes they're useful, sometimes they're less useful. Just depends on the kind that you've got. Starch, for example. So if you're eating potatoes, you might have a lot of starch in there. So if you had a boiled potato and you left it on your tongue for a while, it would start to taste sweet because it's just a whole bunch of glucose molecules, one after the other, after the other, after the other. So if your body starts to break those down, then you start to taste those sugars in there. That's why we have that salivary amylase in our mouths. Um, that breaks down things like starches back into glucose. So pasta is oatmeal. Potatoes have a lot of starch in them. If you ever get those soda crackers or those crackers that you use for cheese and crackers, or um, I don't know what else they're called, saltine crackers. Either way, you put them on your tongue, you let them sit there, and after about 5 to 10 seconds, they start to taste sweet because you're breaking that starch back into glucose for your body. Plants, they're used to store extra glucose. So if they have lots of glucose that they've produced, instead of just having a whole bunch of glucose floating around, a plant might store that instead, and that's going to be used as alpha glucose, and that is going to be a starch that's inside of plants. So that's why plants have all that sugar in them. Now, likewise, you can get something called cellulose. Cellulose is also a glucose chain, but the difference is that you're flipping. So one glucose is one way, the next one is upside down, the next one is the right way up, the next one is upside down. So you're going back and forth. Cell walls for a lot of plants are going to have cellulose in them. This is harder for our bodies to break down. Wood, for example, if you put a chunk of wood in your mouth, it's not going to taste sweet, even though there's glucose in there. That's because your enzyme doesn't have any way of breaking that molecule up. Our enzymes have to approach a molecule from one side to break it up, which is easy in starch because everything is facing the same way. Imagine a line of people holding hands and they're all facing away. And if you have to sneak up and steal the wallet out of someone's back pocket, it's easier to do that when they're all facing away. But if they're alternating, one is facing one way, one person's facing the other way, you won't be able to do it anymore because someone will always see you. In this case, cellulose, you can't really break it down. So we have a hard time. Our bodies cannot deal with cellulose, which is why you can't eat things like wood or grass. It's our body recognizes that as a fiber. We can't digest it. If you have a small-ish amount, it'll just go through your whole system. The problem is a small amount is really hard to visualize for our body's sake. So if you ate a really teeny tiny piece of wood, that teeny tiny piece of wood is actually a really large portion compared to the chyme that's inside of your small intestine. So that will cause a lot of problems. Same thing with grass. Okay, don't eat grass, but if you did, it will clog up your intestines because it can't be digested. So it just sits there, it blocks things up, and then you have other issues you have to deal with. Okay, so this is called beta glucose. Beta glucose is just flipped upside down. Alpha glucose is the glucose that we like to work with. And then the last one I want to show you is called glycogen. Glycogen is a branched sugar polymer. It goes all over the place. It's a wonderful place to store sugar for our bodies. So our bodies aren't as organized. Starch is awesome because everything is like, facing the exact same way. Everything looks neat and tidy. Cellulose, same thing. It's flipping one after the other. So an example I have is my desk, right? So beginning of the semester, I have all my papers pointing the same way. They're sitting on my desk. It looks nice and neat and tidy, but I've got two different Bio 30S sections. So when I take your assignments in on paper, one class I put in one direction, so landscape mode, and the other class I take in the other direction, which will be portrait mode. I did that backwards: landscape mode and portrait mode. So that way, when I'm flipping through your papers, I know how to organize you guys back and forth. It doesn't look as neat, but that's like cellulose. I can still organize myself this way. Glycogen is when you take all those papers and you just throw them into a pile. They're there, right? So if I want to find your assignment, I can flip through and find it, but there's no organization. It takes up my desk. So if you looked at my desk now, it's more like glycogen where everything is all over the place. As animals, we like to store glucose in our bodies this way. So just so you can see what those look like, starch, as you can see, they're all facing the exact same way. Cellulose, they're facing in opposite directions every single time. Glycogen is all over the place. This can go on forever in multiple directions. Anywho, this is carbohydrates. I didn't want to get into it in any more detail than this, just so you have an idea of what these sugars are and where they come from. You should be able to recognize the difference between mono, di, and polysaccharides, but we'll continue this on with enzymes and see if there's something that we can recognize about how enzymes are going to help us break through some of these sugars a little bit later on. Anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.